Story 1. I owned an erm house for several years, but I stopped due to the stress of keeping up with it while maintaining my actual job. The benefit of using erm, as opposed to regular renting, was the chance to make more money when the house got booked frequently. Being in a high-traffic vacation area, erm was an excellent option for us. Initially, my wife and I were excited, but as more people booked the house, it became more demanding. We had to stick to schedules, hire cleaning services between guests, and respond promptly to messages and emails. Most of the time, I rarely saw the guests. After they informed me that they were inside and everything was good, I would relax for the rest of the day. I rarely had extensive conversations with the guests, usually limited to a few texts when they arrived and when they left, along with the occasional question about the house. One night, a young couple stayed at the house. As usual, I texted them the door's unlock code. However, that night, the young man staying at the house texted me, saying he was going to call me. When he did, he informed me that the water wasn't working in the house. I didn't understand how that could be possible, but I knew living in a house without water was unacceptable. So I offered to come check it out quickly, so I could have someone fix it in the morning. He agreed politely. When I arrived at the property, I noticed 2 cars in the driveway. At the time, it wasn't necessarily a red flag, but it was odd because they were supposedly a young couple on vacation for a single night. I thought someone might be visiting them, which wasn't allowed, but I didn't mind much. I entered the house after knocking and using the door's unlock code. It was quiet, and I expected them to be waiting for me, but I couldn't see them anywhere. I didn't think much of it at first, as I was tired and wanted to fix the water issue quickly. I went to the basement to check the main water valve to ensure there wasn't a leak or a flood. Everything seemed normal, and I didn't find any signs of damage. However, the valve had been manually turned off. I turned it back on, and water started flowing again. I remained in the basement for another minute, trying to understand why someone had turned off the water. It made me feel uncomfortable, especially since I hadn't seen anyone when I entered. I decided to leave and call them back just to be safe. As I walked toward the stairs, I heard the basement door open and several sets of footsteps walking down. At the bottom, 3 men stood there. They asked if the issue was fixed. I was hesitant but assured them it should be working now. They just stood there, watching me. As I tried to leave, I noticed one of the men had a gun tucked into the back of his pants. I quickly left the basement, and they didn't follow me. When I got home, I told my wife what had happened. She convinced me to call the police, considering that they weren't the people we thought were staying there, and the situation was strange. The police arrived, but they found no signs of anyone in the house. The next day, we learned that the man had paid with a stolen card. Additionally, they had stolen some expensive decorations and appliances. It turned out there was never a young couple staying there. The one thing that remained unexplained was their plan with the water not working. We suspect they either wanted me not to charge them for their stay, allowing them to use the stolen card for a more extended period, or they were planning to rob me at gunpoint. But it was puzzling that they let me go, considering they had trapped me in the basement. After that incident, I never visited the house while guests were present. A few months later, we stopped using Erin and simply rented out the house. Story 2 by Max Rubin. Years ago, I used Craigslist to find a room for rent. I was looking for a house that I could live in and rent with a roommate or roommates. It took about a week to find a suitable place to live. I had several phone conversations with the owner before I found the right fit. The owner, who would be my roommate, seemed like a genuinely nice guy about the same age. He explained everything about the apartment, and I felt we had a good rapport. Everything looked perfect, but something was bothering me. I gathered my stuff, which wasn't much, and put it in the trunk of my car. In 30 minutes, I drove to my future home, which was outside of town in a wooded area. There was a long driveway leading away from the road leading to the house. When I arrived, I realized that it was not what I expected. The house was very old, at least 100 years old, and the photos on Craigslist suggested a more modern interior. Nevertheless, everything inside was well maintained, clean, and recently renovated. I was satisfied and checked in the same evening. The first few days went by without any problems. It wasn't like finding a place on Craigslist. It was like living with a friend. Aaron, my roommate, worked in the city, so most of the time he wasn't home, and I worked from home. Everything was going smoothly, except for one locked door that didn't raise any questions for me. I figured it was the door to the basement, even though Aaron never mentioned a basement, claiming it was a one-story house. A few days later, something strange happened. Aaron came home before dinner and went to bed early because he had to get up early the next day. I sat up a little longer, but then I heard his bedroom door open. I listened because I had nothing else to do, but there were no other sounds. A few minutes later, I heard him walking slowly down the hallway towards my room. He stopped near my door and knocked on it softly, as if to press himself against it. He stayed there for a while, though I couldn't tell how long. Eventually he left, but not to his room. Instead, he headed down the main hallway, and I heard another door open and close. I was left wondering what he was doing and where he was going. I lay awake waiting for him to return, but he never did. Over the next few nights, I noticed this situation repeating itself. About 30 minutes after I went to bed, Aaron would start acting out the same pattern. Open his door, freeze at my door, and then walk to the closed door. He never slept in his room. He always slept behind that mysterious closed door. This whole situation was making me uncomfortable. I decided that I needed to figure out what was going on because I was starting to feel loopsy. One night I decided to talk to him about his nightly ritual. When Aaron opened the bedroom door and repeated his usual ritual, I took the opportunity to talk to him. "Why do you go to that door every night, Aaron?" I asked. He stared at me with visible surprise. "Is everything okay with you?" We stood on opposite sides of the long, dark hallway, but he continued to stare at me with wide-open eyes. I took a step closer and spoke his name again, but he didn't respond. Instead, he abruptly turned and ran around the corner and out the back door into the dark forest. I was left shocked and shaking, not realizing what had happened. I closed the back door, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and walked over to the locked door. It was indeed a basement, but it hadn't been renovated like the rest of the house. The walls were old and dilapidated. I decided to go downstairs, but the longer I stood there, the more fear I felt. Finally, I decided to go back to my room. I hastily packed my things into 2 suitcases, loaded them into my car, and drove away without once looking back. I never spoke to Aaron again, and he didn't try to contact me either. I couldn't explain what was going on in that house, and I wanted no part of it. Years later, my curiosity took over. I looked up information about the house on the internet and found some strange information. The house had been demolished years ago, and an article published 5 years earlier, shortly after I left, stated that the house had been abandoned because of criminal findings. The nature of the criminal findings was not mentioned in the article. This discovery shocked me for a few weeks, and while incidents like this may not happen that often these days, one can never be too careful. Story 3, by Anonymous. I am 25 years old, and this incident happened 3 years ago. I had just signed a lease on a small house in the town where I lived. After living in an apartment for a few years, I hadn't had time to get any furniture or major home decorations. While the couch and TV cabinet were decent sized, the TV I was going to put in the bedroom was quite small because of its size. Not having a lot of money, I turned to Craigslist to find a larger TV for the living room. I found some nice flat-screen TVs on the site, but they cost more than my budget and were much nicer than I needed. I just needed a large TV to fill the space in my living room and not worry about picture quality. Finally, I came across a TV that I felt met my requirements. It was cheap, large, and appeared to be in working order, although it was an old flat-screen TV from 10 years ago, which was not considered flat by today's standards because it was thicker and heavier. I emailed the owner and continued my search. Since I couldn't find anything else worthy of consideration, I decided to take a chance on this TV. The next morning, I received a reply from the owner, Mitch. There was a lot of excitement in his response, which struck me as a bit odd. It made me a little uneasy, but I attributed it to enthusiasm. We set up a meeting for the next day at 6:30 p.m., and I accepted an invitation from Google Calendar labeled Craigslist TV. It seemed unusual, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I made sure my car was ready and headed to work the next day. After work, I drove to Mitch's address in the dark, with lights on everywhere in his house. When I parked in the driveway, I noticed that the front door was partially open. No screen door, just the main door. Assuming it was left open for me, I leaned over to look inside, but saw no one. I rang the doorbell, and at the same moment I heard a noise coming from the far end of the house, followed by an eerie silence. The sound sent shivers down my spine and made me feel uneasy. I got a bad feeling and decided to leave. But then I heard footsteps approaching the door from inside. The door opened a little wider and a man appeared behind it. He asked if I needed anything, with half of his body still hidden behind the door. I explained that I had come to watch TV, mentioning our appointment scheduled for 6:30 p.m. He hesitated for a moment, then agreed, letting me inside. As soon as I entered, I sensed something was wrong. He didn't fit the cheerful image I had formed based on our email correspondence. He was a large, grumpy, middle-aged man. I had already entered, and it was too late to back out. The TV was in the room adjacent to the door, and it stood there while I examined it. I agreed to buy it without even checking it out. I just wanted to get the meeting over with quickly. I handed him the money. He glanced at it briefly and tucked it away in his pocket. Then, without warning, he grabbed me by the shoulder, pushed me toward the door, and yelled at me to leave. I didn't argue, rushed to my car, and drove off. Soon I pulled over to the side of the road, dialed the police, and reported the robbery. I couldn't believe how reckless they had been, robbing me and then letting me go, knowing that I knew their address. However, what I was later told by the police left me in complete shock. The man I met at the house was not Mitch. It was another Craigslist buyer who was picking up kitchenware that Mitch was selling. This man ended up beating and robbing Mitch minutes before I arrived. Even more surprisingly, Mitch also sent him a Google Calendar invitation with his email address, which turned out to be his first and last name. The police apprehended the robber a few days later. During the course of the investigation, I had the opportunity to meet Mitch, who turned out to be an affable older man despite his ordeal.